1987. A black man from Baltimore walks into a boardroom of white executives in Paris and tells them he's buying their billion-dollar company. They don't laugh because he's already done the impossible once before. 2 months later, the deal closes. It's the biggest acquisition in history by an African American. Yet his name was erased from the history books. Until now. America in the 1980s. The decade of greed. The 1980s were the golden age of American capitalism. Wall Street was booming. Leveraged buyouts were creating overnight millionaires. Forbes was publishing its first billionaire list. Corporate raiders were becoming household names. But there was a problem. Every face on that list was white. This wasn't coincidence. This was centuries of systematic exclusion coming to its logical conclusion. Let's rewind. For 246 years, enslaved Africans built America's wealth while owning nothing. After emancipation in 1865, Jim Crow laws made it illegal for black people to own certain businesses, live in certain neighborhoods, or access capital from white banks. By the 1960s, the average black family had 1/10 the wealth of a white family. Banks openly practiced redlining, refusing loans to black entrepreneurs regardless of qualifications. Even the few black people who built successful businesses faced violence. In 1921, the thriving black business district of Greenwood, Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, was burned to the ground by white mobs. Over 300 black people were murdered. Millions in black wealth disappeared overnight. The message was clear. Black people were not supposed to have wealth, and they certainly weren't supposed to have power. By 1980, there were 13 billionaires in America. 0 were black. The question everyone asked was, could a black person even become a billionaire in America? Most people, black and white, thought the answer was no. The system was designed to prevent it. But one man didn't accept that answer. To understand what comes next, you need to understand what it took for a black person to even attempt entering the world of high finance in the 1980s America. First barrier: education. Elite business schools like Harvard and Wharton had only recently begun admitting significant numbers of black students. The networks, the mentorships, the family connections that white students inherited, black students had to build from scratch. Second barrier: capital. Banks wouldn't lend to black entrepreneurs. Venture capitalists wouldn't invest. The Old Boys Club of Wall Street was exactly that. Old white boys who made deals on golf courses and in country clubs where black people weren't allowed. Third barrier: credibility. Every meeting was a battle to be taken seriously. Every negotiation carried an unspoken question. What are you doing here? Fourth barrier: the deals themselves. The biggest, most lucrative companies were never offered to black buyers. When they were, the financing mysteriously fell through. When financing was approved, the terms were deliberately punitive. The system had 1,000 ways to say no. Enter Reginald Francis Lewis. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1942. His parents separated when he was young. His mother worked multiple jobs as a waitress to keep the family afloat. He grew up in a working-class black neighborhood, where dreams of wealth seemed impossible. But his grandfather told him something he never forgot. You're as good as anybody else. Don't let anyone tell you different. Lewis was brilliant. He excelled in school. He won a football scholarship to Virginia State University, a historically black college. He graduated and did the unthinkable for a black man in 1965. He applied to Harvard Law School. He got in. At Harvard, he was one of only 6 black students in his class. He walked into classrooms where professors had never taught a black student. He studied in libraries where white students moved away when he sat down. He graduated near the top of his class. He got hired by a prestigious Wall Street law firm, one of the first black lawyers they'd ever hired. And then he started watching, learning, planning. Lewis spent the 1970s learning how the game was really played. He saw white lawyers half as smart making partner. He saw mediocre white businessmen getting million-dollar loans. He saw deals happening behind closed doors that black people were never invited to. He realized something crucial. The system would never let him in. So he would have to break down the door. In 1983, Lewis made his move. Lewis had saved every penny. He'd built relationships with a few investors willing to bet on him. He'd identified a target, McCall Pattern Company, a sewing pattern business that was struggling but had hidden value. The asking price, $22.5 million. Lewis had almost none of it. But he understood leverage. He understood debt. He understood something the white businessmen around him had been doing for decades. You don't need money to buy a company. You need a plan. Lewis put together a leveraged buyout, using the company's own assets as collateral for the loan to buy it. It was risky. It was brilliant. And it was exactly what white corporate raiders had been doing to get rich. The white bankers were skeptical. A black man wanting to buy a company? Using this much leverage? It seemed impossible. But Lewis's plan was flawless. His projections were conservative. His strategy was sound. The deal closed. Reginald Lewis now owned a $22.5 million company. He became one of the first black Americans to complete a major leveraged buyout. But he didn't stop there. He restructured McCall Pattern, cut costs, improved operations, focused on profitability. Within 3 years, he sold it for $63 million. He'd turned $1 million of his own money into a $50 million profit. Wall Street noticed. The white establishment couldn't ignore him anymore. But Lewis wasn't satisfied. He was just getting started. What he did next would shatter every ceiling, break every barrier, and prove that a black man could play at the highest levels of global capitalism. He set his sights on something massive, something that would require $985 million, something that would make him a billionaire. 1987. Reginald Lewis identified his target. Beatrice International Foods. This wasn't some small struggling company. This was a global food conglomerate with operations in 31 countries. Ice cream in Spain, meats in France, beverages in Asia. It generated $1.8 billion in annual revenue. It was owned by Beatrice Companies, which was selling off its international division. Lewis wanted it, all of it. The price, $985 million. To put that in perspective, this would be the largest leveraged buyout ever completed by an African American. By far. It wasn't even close. The white business establishment thought he was crazy. How could a black man from Baltimore finance a billion-dollar deal? Where would he get the money? Who would lend to him? But Lewis had learned the game better than the people who created it. He flew to Paris. He met with executives. He presented his plan with precision and confidence. He secured financing from Michael Milken's Drexel Burnham Lambert, the same firm financing white corporate raiders. The negotiation was brutal. Every term was questioned. Every projection scrutinized. Lewis faced obstacles white buyers never encountered. But his plan was perfect. His numbers worked. On December 5, 1987, the deal closed. Reginald Lewis now controlled Beatrice International Foods, a billion-dollar global empire. He renamed it TLC Beatrice International. TLC stood for The Lewis Company. Overnight, he became the first black person in American history to build a company generating over $1 billion in annual revenue. By 1992, TLC Beatrice was the largest black-owned business in America, generating $1.8 billion annually. Forbes estimated Lewis's personal net worth at over $400 million, making him one of the wealthiest black people in the world. He had done the impossible. He had broken through every barrier. He had proven that a black man could compete and win at the highest levels of global capitalism. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. In 1993, at the age of 50, Reginald Lewis died from brain cancer. He was at the peak of his power. His company was thriving. He was planning even bigger deals. And then he was gone. And then something else happened. History forgot him. Business schools didn't teach his story. Forbes didn't celebrate his legacy. Business television didn't commemorate his achievements. Meanwhile, white entrepreneurs with far smaller accomplishments became legends. Their names were plastered on magazine covers. Their stories became case studies. They were called self-made and visionary. But Reginald Lewis, who had overcome more obstacles, navigated more barriers, and achieved something statistically more impressive, was erased. Why? Because his success threatened the narrative. The narrative that said black people weren't capable of building billion-dollar empires. The narrative that said wealth and power were white spaces. Lewis proved that narrative was a lie, and lies don't like being exposed. But here's the final revelation. 8 years after Lewis died, in 2001, Robert L. Johnson, founder of BET, Black Entertainment Television, sold his network to Viacom for $3 billion and became America's first black billionaire in terms of personal net worth. Johnson's achievement was historic and important. But here's what they don't tell you. If Reginald Lewis had lived another 5 years, he would have been there first. His company was growing. His net worth was climbing. At his trajectory, he would have crossed the billion-dollar mark by the late 1990s. Brain cancer took that from him. And history took his legacy. The power of memory. So who was the first black billionaire? The answer depends on how you measure. If you mean the first to build a billion-dollar company, Reginald Francis Lewis, 1987. If you mean the first to achieve billionaire personal net worth, Robert L. Johnson, 2001. But here's what matters more than dates and numbers. Reginald Lewis proved that the system designed to exclude black people from wealth could be beaten. He walked into rooms where black people had never been allowed. He completed deals that black people were told they could never do. He built an empire in a world that said black empires couldn't exist. And then that world tried to forget him. His story wasn't taught in schools. His name wasn't in textbooks. A generation of black children grew up never hearing about the man who proved it was possible. That's not an accident. That's suppression. Because if young black people knew that someone who looked like them had conquered Wall Street, had owned a billion-dollar company, had beaten the system at its own game, what might they believe was possible for themselves? The greatest theft in history isn't money. It's memory. They can take our wealth. They can take our achievements. But they can't take our stories, unless we let them. Reginald Lewis died too young. But his legacy lives in every black entrepreneur who refuses to accept limits. Every black student who walks into Harvard. Every black business person who sits at tables where they weren't invited. He proved it could be done. Now the question is, will we remember? Will we tell his story? Will we make sure the next generation knows his name? Because the system that erased him is still operating. Still trying to convince black people that wealth and power aren't for them. But Reginald Lewis already proved that was a lie. His name was Reginald Francis Lewis. He built a billion-dollar empire, and history will not forget him again. Remember his name. Tell his story. Because the truth is our inheritance. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Reginald F. Lewis. Subscribe to uncover more hidden Black history. Comment below. What untold story should we tell next?